The stone steps of the Ashford estate felt colder than the December air, each slab of Tennessee marble radiating a chill that had nothing to do with the season, and everything to do with the woman standing in the doorway. Constance Ashford wore her wool coat-like armor, the fabric a shade of charcoal that matched the winter sky, and her pearls, authentic 3 generations old, caught what little light filtered through the iron-gray clouds overhead. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe chignon. Not a strand out of place despite the wind, and her pale eyes held all the warmth of the ice coating the fountain in the center of the circular driveway. Her posture spoke of bloodlines and bank accounts of country clubs where memberships passed through wills rather than applications. Behind her, just visible in the shadows of the foyer with its crystal chandelier and marble floors imported from Carrara, stood Thaddeus Ashford. 47 years old, his face carried the particular hardness that comes from a lifetime of getting everything except the one thing that mattered. His arms crossed over a cashmere sweater that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month, and his expression held a satisfaction that bordered on triumph. On those stone steps, breath-forming white clouds in the bitter air. Margot Lindgren clutched her 3 sons against her legs. The boys, Finn Grayson and Beckett, 7 years old and identical in the way that only triplets can be wore. Winter coats 2 sizes too small, the cuffs riding high above their wrists, the zippers struggling against growth spurts no one had money to accommodate. Each child held a black garbage bag, the heavy-duty kind meant for lawn work, stuffed with clothes and toys and the few possessions they'd been allowed to pack in the 30 minutes Constance had given them after announcing the eviction. Finn, the oldest by 3 minutes, had positioned himself slightly in front of his brothers. His young face set in an expression of defiance that broke something in Margot every time she looked at it. Grayson stood in the middle, his eyes too wide, his breathing too shallow, already showing the signs of the anxiety that would follow him for years. And Beckett, the baby of the 3, kept his face pressed against Margot's hip, his small shoulders shaking with sobs he was trying desperately to swallow. The car waited at the edge of the driveway, a 1998 Toyota Corolla with rust eating through the wheel well's exhaust, coughing gray smoke into the winter air. One headlight held in place with duct tape because the mounting bracket had snapped 6 months ago, and there'd been no money to fix it properly. The dented fender caught the weak afternoon light, a testament to an accident in a grocery store parking lot that insurance lapsed 3 weeks before impact had refused to cover. Constance's voice carried the cultured accent of old Southern wealth, each word precisely enunciated and sharp as a blade. Years of elocution lessons and finishing school had polished away any trace of regional softness, leaving only crystal-clear contempt. "I want you to understand something, Margot. This is not cruelty, this is necessity." The words hung in the frozen air between them, visible almost like the exhalations that carried them. "For 14 months we have fed you, housed you, and tolerated your presence in this family. 14 months since my son had the poor judgment to die and leave us with his unfortunate choices." Margot felt the words like physical blows, each one landing with precision. She forced herself to stand straighter to meet her mother-in-law's cold gaze without flinching, though her hands trembled where they rested on Finn's shoulders. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, but steady. "Michael loved me. He loved these boys. Whatever you thought of our marriage, he chose me, and he would be ashamed to see you treat his children this way." Thaddeus stepped forward into the winter light, his face hardening into lines carved by years of entitlement and disappointed expectations. Money had never been enough for him. He'd been born to it, raised in it, and it had taught him nothing except that the world owed him more. "Michael is dead. He's been dead for 14 months, and you've been living off this family's charity every single day since. You're 28 years old, perfectly capable of working and supporting yourself. It's time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet instead of depending on the Ashford name." Margot's mind flashed to the applications, 47 of them in the past 3 months alone. Every restaurant within 20 miles, every retail store, every office that might hire someone with an incomplete teaching degree and a resume gap measured in years of raising triplets. The phone calls that went unreturned, the interviews that somehow never materialized. The receptionist at Anderson's Hardware who'd looked at her application glanced at the name and said without meeting her eyes that they'd decided to promote from within. She'd understood then, standing in that hardware store with its smell of sawdust and paint, that the Ashford family's influence reached into every corner of this insular mountain town. That Constance had made calls, pulled strings, ensured that every door in Ashford, Tennessee would remain closed to the woman who'd had the audacity to marry her younger son. Constance's expression did not change as she delivered her final words, each syllable falling like a judge's gavel. The decision has been made. You have until noon tomorrow to vacate the property. Your vehicle is parked by the service entrance. We've placed $500 in the glove compartment, which is far more than we're obligated to provide. What you do with it and where you go is no longer our concern. Before Margot could respond, before she could find words adequate to the moment, Beckett broke free from his brothers and lunged forward. His small fists pounded against the massive oak door, the sound hollow and desperate. No, Grandma, please, we'll be good. We won't eat so much. We promise we'll be quiet. Please don't make us leave. For just a moment, a fragment of a second that might have been imagination, something flickered across Constance's face. A shadow that could have been doubt or shame or the ghost of some long-buried maternal instinct, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the ice that had long ago replaced whatever warmth might once have existed in her chest. Her voice softened, but the change made it worse, somehow more final. This was never your home, child. Your father should have known better than to bring his mistakes into this family. The door closed with a heavy thud that echoed across the snow-covered grounds, a sound like a coffin lid settling into place. Beckett collapsed against it, his 7-year-old body racked with sobs that tore themselves from somewhere deep in his chest. Margot sank to her knees on the frozen stone, gathering him into her arms while Finn and Grayson pressed close, their tears freezing on their cheeks in the bitter wind that swept down from the Smoky Mountains. In that moment, huddled together on the cold steps of a house that had never truly been their home. Despite 14 months of pretending, the four of them clung to each other as the only warmth in a world that had suddenly become impossibly cruel. The fountain's ice glittered in the failing light. Constance's silhouette moved away from the door's frosted glass, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out across the winter landscape, its cry swallowed by the wind. The drive from the Ashford estate to Ida Kowalski's property took 37 minutes along roads that grew narrower and rougher with each passing mile. The Corolla's engine coughed and sputtered, protesting the grade as Margot coaxed it up steep inclines and around hairpin turns where guardrails had long since rusted away or been knocked down by logging trucks that no longer came this way. The boys sat in silence in the back seat, their garbage bags clutched on their laps, their eyes tracking the landscape as it transformed from the manicured wealth of their former prison to the raw, unforgiving beauty of the deeper mountains. Margot's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white, not from the treacherous road but from the effort of holding herself together, of not allowing the tears burning behind her eyes to fall where her sons could see them. She'd called Ida from a gas station payphone 20 minutes after the eviction, her voice breaking as she explained what had happened, and the elderly woman had not hesitated for even a moment. "Oh, Kochanya. Oh, sweetheart. Of course, yes. Come immediately. The trailer, it is empty. You are welcome to it for as long as you need." The words had been a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, and Margot had clung to them with everything she had left. Ida's property sat at the end of a rutted dirt road that climbed through dense pine forest. A small clearing carved from the wilderness where a modest house stood with peeling paint and a porch that sagged slightly on the left side. Beside it, much smaller, sat what could barely be called a trailer. More of a camper, really. An ancient aluminum rectangle propped up on cinder blocks. Its once white exterior now streaked with rust and green moss where water had run down from a roof that had seen better decades. Ida emerged from her house as Margot's car pulled up, a tiny woman with a cloud of white hair and a face creased by 70 years of hard living and harder losses. She wore a house dress under a heavy cardigan, both patched and repatched, and her feet were shoved into rubber boots too large for her. She rushed to embrace Margot before the younger woman could even fully exit the car, her arms surprisingly strong for someone so small. "Kochanie, Kochanie," she whispered, holding Margot tight while the triplets climbed out and stared at what would be their new home. "Those people, they have no souls, no hearts in their chests, but you are safe now. You and your boys, you are safe." She led them to the trailer, apologizing with every step for its condition, explaining that it had not been used in 3 years, not since her nephew had lived there briefly before moving to Texas for work. The door stuck when she tried to open it, swollen from moisture and neglect, and when it finally gave way with a screech of protesting metal, the smell that wafted out was musty and cold, the scent of abandonment. Inside was a single room barely 12 feet long, a narrow bed built into one end, its mattress stained and probably home to mice. A tiny 2-burner stove connected to a propane tank that might or might not still have fuel. A miniature sink with a faucet that dripped brown water when Ida turned the knob, and a bathroom so small that Margot could not imagine fitting inside it with the door closed. A chemical toilet and a shower stall that would require standing completely still to avoid, touching all 4 walls simultaneously. There was no insulation. The December cold had seeped into every corner, cold enough that she could see her own exhalations indoors. The windows were clouded with grime, their frames warped and cracked. When Margot flipped the light switch, nothing happened. Ida hurried to check the breaker, explaining that the electricity had been turned off to save money. But she would have it reconnected immediately. Tomorrow, perhaps. Maybe the next day if the power company was slow. The triplets set down their garbage bags and instinctively moved together onto the narrow bed, huddling close for warmth. Their arms wrapped around each other in a tangle of small bodies and frightened eyes, and they watched their mother with an expression that asked a question she had no answer for. Margot stood in the center of the tiny space, taking in the water stains on the ceiling, the curling linoleum floor, the ancient curtains hanging limp over the dirty windows. The full weight of their situation crashed down on her with suffocating force. She had $517, the $500 from the glove box plus the $17 she'd had in her purse. 3 traumatized children who'd just lost the only home they'd known since their father died. No job, no prospects, and winter closing in like a fist around them. Ida touched her arm gently, her voice soft with a sympathy that somehow made everything worse. "I will bring blankets and food. Everything will be all right, you will see." Margot nodded mechanically, thanked her friend in a voice that did not sound like her own, and waited until Ida had left, before she turned away from her sons. She pressed her fist against her mouth to muffle the sob that tore from her chest, her shoulders shaking with the force of tears she could no longer contain. 14 months of holding herself together. 14 months of enduring Constance's cutting remarks and Thaddeus's sneers, and the constant reminders that they were charity cases, burdens, mistakes that Michael should never have made. 14 months of trying to shield her boys from the poison in that house while searching desperately for a way out. And this was the way out. A metal box on cinder blocks with no heat and no hope, and a chemical toilet that would freeze solid once the real winter arrived. She was still crying, silent and shaking, when she heard a sound from the narrow bed that made her freeze. A soft whimpering that was distinctly not human. She turned slowly to see Finn unzipping his winter coat with an expression that mixed guilt and defiance in equal measure. From inside the fabric emerged a small golden head with floppy ears and dark eyes that blinked in the dim light of the trailer. A puppy perhaps 6 months old, with fur the color of honey and paws too big for its body. Finn's voice came out small and frightened, clearly expecting anger or punishment. "Mom, we couldn't leave him. We couldn't leave any of them." Grayson and Beckett were already unzipping their own coats, and suddenly there were 3 golden retriever puppies tumbling onto the bed, their tails wagging frantically, their pink tongues lolling as they climbed over each other, and the boys in a mass of fur and desperate joy. Margot felt her heart sink even as something in her chest simultaneously lifted at the sight of her sons' faces, transforming from fear to hope as they gathered the puppies close. The dogs were perhaps 6 months old, still gangly and uncoordinated, their paws enormous promises of the size they'd eventually reach. But they were healthy and clearly well-loved, their coats shining despite everything, their eyes bright with the boundless optimism of young animals who trusted that the world would provide. Finn's words tumbled out in a rush, desperate to explain before she could tell them no. Their names are Copper, Flint, and Ash. Dad gave them to us 2 months before he died. He said every boy needs a dog, and since there were 3 of us, we needed 3 dogs. Grandma Constance said we had to get rid of them the day after the funeral, that they were dirty and cost too much money and made too much noise, but we couldn't, Mom. We just couldn't. Grayson picked up the story, his voice trembling. We hid them in the old gardener's shed, the one way in the back that nobody uses anymore. It still has the heat lamp from when it used to be a greenhouse, and we found a switch that makes it work. We've been sneaking food to them every day for 8 months. At night, after everyone's asleep, and in the morning before Grandma wakes up. She never knew. The full picture crystallized in Margot's mind with devastating clarity. Her sons already grieving their father, forced to hide the last gift he had given them, sneaking out in the cold and dark to care for these animals because the people who should have loved them had denied them even this simple comfort. She thought of the meals the boys had barely touched over the past month's food. She had assumed they were wasting now, understanding they had been smuggling it to the shed. She thought of how they had asked for extra blankets, claiming they were cold, and realized those blankets had gone to keep 3 puppies warm through the winter. Beckett's voice broke through her thoughts, small and pleading. We had to bring them, Mom. When you said we were leaving, we knew we had to. Grandma would have found them after we left. She would have had them taken away or worse. They're all we have left of Daddy. Please don't make us give them up. Please. Margot looked at the 3 puppies, investigating their new surroundings with the boundless curiosity of young dogs, sniffing every corner, their tails wagging in constant metronomes of canine optimism. She did a rapid calculation in her head that made her stomach clench with anxiety. 3 puppies meant food, veterinary care space they did not have in this tiny trailer. It meant at least $50 a week in expenses she could not afford, money that should go to feeding her children instead. It was irresponsible, impossible, completely impractical to keep 3 dogs when they barely had enough resources to keep themselves alive. But as she looked at her sons' faces, at the desperate hope in their eyes, at the way Beckett was holding the smallest puppy like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had turned to quicksand beneath their feet, Margot knew she could not take this away from them. These dogs were not pets. They were the last tangible connection to Michael, the last proof that their father had loved them and thought about their happiness, even knowing his time was limited. The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them. We'll keep them. Relief flooded across 3 identical faces like sunrise. But boys, you have to understand, this makes everything harder. We'll all have to be very careful with money and food. The puppies will need to be fed and taken care of, and that's going to be your responsibility, all 3 of you. Can you do that? The triplets nodded solemnly, and Margot sank down onto the bed beside them, gathering her sons and 3 wiggling puppies into her arms. For the first time since leaving the Ashford estate, she felt something that was not quite hope, but was perhaps its distant cousin. The knowledge that they were a family complete and unbroken, that somehow against all logic and reason they would find a way to survive. That night, after Ida had brought armfuls of blankets that smelled of cedar and mothballs and a box of groceries that Margot accepted with tears of gratitude streaming down her face after the boys and puppies had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. In a pile on the narrow bed, Margot sat on the floor of the tiny trailer, with her back against the cold aluminum wall. She let herself remember Michael Carson as he truly was, not the disappointing son his family had mourned with relief rather than grief, but the man she had loved with her whole heart. She had met him 7 years ago at Mountain View Elementary School, where she worked as a teacher's aide while struggling to finish her education degree at night. Supporting herself during the day, attending classes when she could afford them, living on ramen and hope, and the dream of someday having a classroom of her own. He had arrived one morning in September with a crew to build new playground equipment. And while the other workers had been loud and crude, Michael had been quiet and thoughtful, taking his lunch alone under a tree with a book, his rough hands careful as he turned pages. When the children came out for recess, he had stopped his work to show them how the new slide would function, his face lighting up with genuine joy at their excitement. He had asked her out 3 times before she finally said yes. Convinced that a construction worker who read poetry and built playgrounds with such care could not possibly be serious about a girl who wore thrift store clothes and counted pennies before buying groceries. Their first date had been a picnic in the mountains where he admitted the truth he had been hiding. He was Michael Carson, youngest son of the Ashford family, one of the wealthiest families in eastern Tennessee. But he had walked away from that world after college, unable to stomach the casual cruelty and obsession with status that defined them. He had learned carpentry because he wanted to build things with his hands, to create something real and lasting rather than shuffling papers in an office or collecting dividends from investments he did not understand. His family had been horrified. They viewed his choice as betrayal and embarrassment, a stain on their carefully cultivated image. And when he told them he was marrying Margot, a girl with no money and no connections, whose father drove a truck and whose mother cleaned houses, they had threatened to disown him entirely. Michael had simply shrugged and said he had never wanted their money anyway, that he had enough in his own savings from his carpentry work to build them a good life, and that was all that mattered. They had married in a small ceremony with only Ida and a few friends present. Constance and Thaddeus had refused to attend, sending a card that congratulated Michael on his decision to live according to his principles in a tone that dripped with sarcasm and contempt. For 5 beautiful years they had been happy in a way Margot had never imagined possible. Living in a modest rental house, working jobs they loved, and then welcoming the triplets into the world in 2018 with joy that felt almost painful in its intensity. Michael had been a wonderful father, patient and playful, teaching the boys to use tools almost before they could walk, reading to them every night in voices that made the characters come alive. He had given them those puppies just weeks before the accident because he said every child deserved to know the loyalty of a good dog. He had died on a Tuesday afternoon when improperly secured steel beams had collapsed on a construction site, killing him instantly. The world had ended in the space of a single phone call. A police officer's apologetic voice explaining that her husband was gone and she needed to come identify the body. The Ashfords had swooped in immediately, taking control of everything with an efficiency that felt predatory in retrospect, insisting that Margot and the boys move into the estate where they could be properly cared for. And Margot, drowning in grief and terror about how she would support 3 young sons alone, had agreed, had walked into that beautiful prison and stayed for 14 months because she had nowhere else to go. Michael had always told her not to worry, that he had made sure they would be taken care of, that he had plans and preparations, but Margot had assumed he meant the modest life insurance policy from his employer and perhaps a small savings account, certainly nothing that would sustain them for long. She had never imagined he meant anything more. Never thought to question why his family was so insistent on controlling every aspect of their lives. And now, sitting in a freezing trailer with barely any money left to her name, she wondered what Michael had really meant by those promises, whether somewhere in the rubble of her shattered life there was something she had missed, some piece of him that remained to guide her through the darkness ahead. The next morning arrived gray and bitter, the kind of December day where the sun never quite manages to burn through the clouds. Margot woke to find the boys already up, dressed in their inadequate coats, trying to be quiet as they let the puppies out to relieve themselves in the patch of dead grass behind the trailer. Her breath formed white clouds in the air. The temperature inside could not have been much above freezing. Ida arrived at 8 with 2 blankets she'd found in her attic and a thermos of hot cocoa that the boys accepted with grateful hands. She also brought news that twisted Margot's stomach into knots. "I stopped by Virgil's store this morning, Cochagny, to get milk. He told me there was a town council meeting yesterday about rezoning some old property in the mountains." Margot wrapped her hands around the mug of cocoa Ida had poured for her, letting the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. "What property?" Ida's expression held a complicated mixture of sympathy and something that might have been hope. He said Thaddeus stood up and talked about an old cabin, one that belonged to Michael's grandfather, Harrison, said it was condemned, falling apart, an eyesore that needed to be demolished for commercial development. The cocoa turned bitter in Margot's mouth. Why would Thaddeus care about an old cabin? Because, Kochania, according to what Virgil heard, the property now belongs to you. Something in Michael's will, a piece of land with a cabin on it out in Cherokee National Forest. Thaddeus was very upset that he could not just tear it down. The trust prevents sale or destruction without your permission. Margot's mind raced. Michael had never mentioned a cabin, never said anything about property or inheritance beyond vague reassurances that everything would be okay. But then he had kept many things from her, trying to protect her from his family's reach, trying to shield her from exactly the kind of manipulation she'd endured for 14 months. Virgil said something else. Ida's voice dropped lower, more serious. He said Thaddeus made fun of you at the meeting, said you were planning to move to the cabin with 3 children, that you were crazy to think you could live in a condemned structure. People laughed. The humiliation burned through Margot like acid. She could picture it perfectly, Thaddeus standing before the council in one of his expensive suits, his voice dripping with amused contempt as he described the foolish woman his brother had married. The town leaders laughing along, enjoying the spectacle of someone else's misery. But beneath the humiliation, something else stirred, a small flame of defiance that Michael had planted years ago when he'd chosen her despite his family's objections. When he'd walked away from wealth and status because he believed in building something real with his own hands. "Where is this cabin?" Ida pulled a folded paper from her pocket. Virgil wrote down what he remembered from the meeting. About 80 miles from here, up in the mountains, near where 3 streams come together. He said Harrison Ashford built it back in the 1960s, used to spend summers there. But after Harrison died in 1994, nobody went anymore. The county condemned it last year because the roof was failing. Margot took the paper, studying the rough directions Virgil had sketched. Her mind was already working through the logistics, the impossibilities, the desperate mathematics of survival. They could not stay in this trailer through winter. What little money remained would last perhaps 3 days if she was very careful. She had no job and no prospect of getting one in a town where the Ashford name opened every door except the ones she tried to walk through. But property, even condemned property, was something. Land was something. A cabin in the mountains far from Constance's influence and Thaddeus's sneers might be a chance, might be the only chance they had. The boys were watching her from the bed where they sat with the puppies, their young face serious beyond their years. They had learned too early that the world was not kind, that safety was fragile, that the adults who should protect them could not always be trusted. But they still looked at her with hope, with belief that somehow their mother would find a way through this darkness. Finn spoke first, his voice carrying a determination that reminded her achingly of Michael. "Dad always said he'd take us to the mountains someday, to the place where he used to think, maybe this is it." Margot looked at her oldest son, at the set of his jaw and the steadiness in his eyes, and made a decision that would change everything. "Then we'll go see it. All of us. Tomorrow." The black sedan appeared in Ida's driveway 3 hours after Margot made her decision about the cabin, its polished surface reflecting the gray morning sky like dark water. The car looked expensive and out of place against the peeling paint of Ida's modest house and the rusted trailer where Margot stood watching through the grimy window. When the driver's door opened, a man in his early 50s emerged carrying a leather briefcase, his steel gray hair immaculately trimmed, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the weak winter light. Everything about him spoke of professional competence and urban sophistication. The cut of his suit suggested money without ostentation. The kind of tailoring that came from knowing exactly which shops to visit and never needing to ask about prices. His shoes were leather polished but not shiny, the choice of someone who understood that real wealth whispered rather than shouted. Margot's first thought was that Constance had sent someone to threaten her, perhaps an attorney, to demand she sign away rights to something or papers relinquishing any claim to the Ashford name. Her body tensed as he approached the trailer, her mind already racing through responses to whatever legal intimidation he planned to deliver. He knocked politely on the aluminum door, the sound hollow and tinny. When Margot opened it, keeping herself positioned between this stranger and her sons who sat on the bed with the puppies, he extended a business card that read Marshall Hightower, estate attorney, with a Knoxville address and phone number printed in understated font. His voice carried the neutral professionalism of someone trained to deliver both good news and bad with equal composure. Mrs. Margot Lindgren. She took the card warily, her fingers cold against the expensive cardstock. Yes. I've been searching for you for 3 weeks. The Ashford estate refused to provide your current location and the county had no forwarding address on file. I finally tracked you through a friend of yours, Mrs. Ida Kowalski, who was kind enough to direct me here after I convinced her I meant you no harm. Margot's mind raced through possibilities, none of them making sense. I don't understand. I don't have an estate. I don't have anything. Marshall Hightower glanced around at the dilapidated trailer, the clothesline strung between trees where Margot had hung wet clothes that were now frozen stiff, the visible poverty of her situation. Something like genuine concern crossed his features, a crack in his professional mask. Mrs. Lindgren, I need to ask you a very specific question, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. He paused, choosing his words with obvious care. Are you aware that your husband Michael maintained a private safety deposit box? The question was so unexpected, so completely outside anything Margot had been anticipating, that she simply stared at him for a long moment. Behind her, she could hear Finn whispering to his brothers, telling them to be quiet, to let Mom talk. A safety deposit box number. Michael and I had a joint checking account at First Mountain Bank and a small savings account, but that's all. When he died, the Ashfords took control of everything. They said there was barely anything left after the funeral expenses. Marshall's expression shifted, becoming more intent, a lawyer who had just heard something significant. The box was opened in Michael's name alone 6 years ago, shortly after your marriage. I represent a trust that has been monitoring it, and according to our records, it has never been accessed except for the initial deposit. He pulled a document from his briefcase, unfolding it carefully. Mrs. Lindgren, I have reason to believe that your husband placed something of significant value in that box. Something that legally belongs to you and your children. Before Margot could respond, before she could even begin to process what he was saying, Marshall's gaze shifted to something behind her. His entire demeanor changed in an instant. His face went pale and his hand tightened on his briefcase with enough force that his knuckles whitened. Mrs. Lindgren, don't turn around, but there's a black SUV parked on the main road about 200 yards down. It's been sitting there since I arrived. Do you recognize the vehicle? Margot's heart began to pound. She turned despite his warning and saw it through the trailer's small window. A large black SUV with tinted windows positioned where the dirt road met the paved county route. Too far away to identify the occupants, but close enough to be watching. Close enough to be waiting. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. No, I've never seen it before. Marshall pulled a phone from his pocket and took a photograph of the distant vehicle, his movements quick and nervous. Mrs. Lindgren, I need you to listen very carefully. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me. Your husband's family knows about the safety deposit box, and they have been actively working to prevent you from ever learning of its existence. He gestured toward the SUV with his phone. That vehicle likely contains people they've hired to monitor you. I need to leave now before they identify me and understand what's happening. But I'll contact you again soon at a safer location. In the meantime, tell no one about this conversation, especially not anyone connected to the Ashford family. Do you understand? Margot nodded, her mouth dry, her mind struggling to catch up with a reality that had just become infinitely more complicated and dangerous. Marshall was already moving toward his sedan, his professional composure cracking around the edges. Box 447, First National Bank, Chattanooga. Remember that number? And Mrs. Lindgren... He paused at his car door. Whatever you do, don't let them know you're looking for anything. If they realize you know about the box, they'll move heaven and earth to get there first. He climbed into his car and drove away, leaving Margot standing beside a clothesline in the cold mountain air with more questions than answers, and the distinct feeling that her life had just become something she no longer understood. The boys emerged from the trailer, Copper, Flint, and Ash at their heels. Their young faces worried. Grayson's voice was small. "Mom, who was that man?" Margot knelt down to their level, pulling them close, feeling the solid warmth of their small bodies against hers. "Someone who knew your father. Someone who's trying to help us." But even as she said the words, she wondered if that was true. Wondered if Marshall Hightower was really an ally or just another player in a game she did not understand, with rules no one had bothered to explain. The rest of that day passed in a fog of uncertainty and planning. Margot sat at the trailer's tiny fold-down table with Virgil's hand-drawn map and what little money remained, trying to make impossible mathematics work. The cabin was 87 miles away, according to Virgil's best guess. The Corolla got perhaps 20 miles to the gallon on a good day, which meant she would need at least 5 gallons of gas just to reach the property and return. At current prices, that would consume most of what she had left. Ida found her there as afternoon shadows lengthened, her expression troubled. She set a small envelope on the table, the kind that held greeting cards. "Kochania, I cannot give you much. My pension, it is small, but take this, please." Inside was $200 in worn bills, probably most of what Ida had saved for the month. Margot's eyes filled with tears as she tried to refuse, but Ida's weathered hand closed over hers with surprising strength. "Michael was good boy, kind boy. He helped me fix my roof 2 years ago, would not take any money. Said helping neighbors was just what people did. You let me help you now. You let his boys have a chance." The money felt heavy in Margot's hand, weighted with obligation and gratitude and the knowledge that accepting it meant Ida would go without something she needed. But pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, and her sons needed more than her principles could provide. "I'll pay you back. Every penny, I promise." Ida's smile was sad and knowing. "You will, but not with money. You will do what Michael would have done. You will help someone else when the time comes." That evening, after the boys had fallen asleep in their nest of blankets with the puppies curled around them, Margot searched through the single garbage bag that contained everything she had salvaged from 14 months at the Ashford estate. Clothes, mostly. A few toys the boys had been allowed to keep. And at the very bottom, wrapped in one of Finn's old t-shirts, a small metal box she had not opened since the funeral. Inside were the things she had taken from Michael's truck after the accident, before Constance could claim them or throw them away. His wallet still holding his driver's license with a photo that showed him smiling, younger than he had been in his final years. A pocket knife he had carried every day, the handle worn smooth by his carpenter's hands. And a small leather-bound notebook, the kind he used for sketching furniture designs and making lists. She had not been able to look at these things for months. The grief had been too raw, the wound too fresh. But now she opened the notebook with trembling fingers, paging through sketches of chairs and tables and built-in shelving units. His handwriting covered the margins, measurements, notes about wood grain, reminders to himself about clients who needed furniture delivered. Near the back, dated 3 months before his death, she found something different. Not a furniture design, but a map hand-drawn with careful attention to detail. Mountain roads marked with distances. A creek labeled with the notation "follows this north 2.4 miles." And at the top, in Michael's distinctive script, the place where it all began. H.A., cabin built 1965. Below the map, written in smaller letters as if he had been talking to himself. "If something happens to me, Emma will remember. She'll know where to look. The foundation holds everything, both what grandfather built and what I've hidden there, where 3 waters meet our future waits." Margot stared at the words until they blurred. Michael had known. Somehow he had known that something might happen to him, that his family might come after whatever he was trying to protect. And he had left her clues, breadcrumbs scattered through the ordinary details of his life, waiting for her to find them when she needed them most. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of December day where the sky achieves a blue so deep it almost hurts to look at. Margot loaded Ida's pickup truck, a battered 1987 Ford that ran more reliably than the Corolla despite its age, with supplies the elderly woman insisted they take. Sleeping bags rated for winter camping, a canvas tent that smelled of mildew but was still waterproof, a camp stove and fuel canisters, canned food, bottled water, rope, a first aid kit, flashlights with batteries that might or might not still hold a charge. You are not planning just to look cochonier. You are planning to stay if you must. Margot could not deny it. The trailer was uninhabitable for winter. What little money she had would not last a week. If the cabin existed, if it could provide any kind of shelter, it might be their only option until she could figure out what to do next. The boys climbed into the truck's cab, excited despite everything, treating this as an adventure rather than the desperate gamble it truly was. Copper, Flint, and Ash rode in the covered truck bed, settling into a nest of blankets with the calm acceptance of dogs who trusted their humans to know what they were doing. Margot pulled out onto the county road at 6:30 in the morning, the sun just beginning to paint the mountain peaks with gold. In her rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of the black SUV pulling out from a side road 200 yards behind them, maintaining a careful distance but definitely following. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. Marshall Hightower had been right. Someone was watching. Someone wanted to know where she was going and what she might find when she got there. The drive into the mountains took longer than Virgil's map suggested, the roads deteriorating from paved highway to gravel to rutted dirt as they climbed higher. The truck handled the terrain better than the Corolla would have. But even so, Margot had to navigate carefully around potholes and washouts where spring runoff had carved channels through the roadbed. Behind them, the black SUV maintained its distance, disappearing around curves only to reappear when the road straightened. Whoever was driving knew these mountains, knew how to follow without being obvious about it. Finn noticed first, his sharp eyes catching the pattern. "Mom, that black car. It's been behind us a long time." She did not want to lie to him. Michael had always said children deserved honesty appropriate to their age, and Finn was old enough to understand danger even if she could not explain all its dimensions. "I know, sweetheart. Someone wants to know where we're going, but they won't hurt us. They're just watching." "Is it Grandma Constance?" The question cut deeper than it should have. That her 7-year-old son's first assumption when confronted with surveillance was that his own grandmother had sent it spoke volumes about the toxicity they had endured. "Maybe, or maybe someone she hired. Either way, we're going to be careful." According to Michael's map, the turnoff to the cabin property came after a distinctive rock formation, 3 boulders stacked in a precarious tower that somehow defied gravity. Margot almost missed it, the narrow track barely visible behind overgrown brush. She turned onto it before she could second-guess herself, the truck bouncing over ruts deep enough to scrape the undercarriage. The trail wound through dense pine forest, climbing steadily. A quarter-mile in, they encountered an obstacle that ended any hope of driving further. A massive pine tree, easily 200 years old, lay across the path. Recent storms had brought it down, its root ball torn from the earth, its enormous trunk blocking the road completely. Margot stopped the truck and sat staring at the fallen giant. Behind them, she could hear the SUV's engine idling on the main road, not following down the track but waiting, watching. "We walk from here." The boys piled out, helping her unload the essential supplies. She packed the tent, sleeping bags, food, and water into backpacks, distributing weight according to what each of them could carry. Finn took 15 pounds without complaint, his small back straightening under the burden. Grayson carried 12, his face serious with concentration. Beckett managed 10 pounds in a pack almost as big as he was. Margot shouldered the heaviest load, 45 pounds of tent, stove, and provisions, and felt the straps cut into her shoulders immediately. This would not be an easy hike. The map suggested another 2.8 miles to the cabin, most of it uphill through terrain that was difficult even in good weather. Copper Flint and Ash jumped down from the truck bed and immediately began exploring the forest with the enthusiasm of young dogs encountering new territory. But something in their bearing suggested purpose beyond simple curiosity. They ranged ahead, sniffing the trail, then circled back to check on the boys before pushing forward again. Michael had trained them. The realization hit Margot with the force of revelation. In those 2 months before his death, when the puppies were just 8 weeks old, he had been teaching them basic commands and behaviors, and retriever instinct honed through generations of selective breeding made them natural trail breakers and guides. The first mile passed in relative quiet, the only sounds their breathing and the crunch of frozen leaves underfoot. The snow depth increased gradually, starting ankle deep and progressing to shin deep where the forest grew thick enough to block the sun. The boys struggled but did not complain, following the paths Copper Flint and Ash broke through the drifts. Margot's back ached and her shoulders burned, but she focused on placing one foot in front of the other, on keeping her sons moving forward, on reaching the cabin before dark. According to Michael's map, they had covered perhaps 1.5 miles when the trail crossed a creek. The water ran clear and fast, about 15 feet wide at this point, its surface frozen in sheets that looked deceptively solid. Margot tested the ice with a stick, watching it flex but not break under the pressure. 6 inches thick, maybe more, enough to support their weight if they crossed carefully. She went first, distributing her weight evenly, feeling the ice groan beneath her boots but hold firm. Finn followed, then Beckett, both making it safely to the far bank. Grayson stepped onto the ice last, moving slowly, placing each foot carefully. He was 3 steps from safety when the ice beneath his right foot cracked with a sound like a gunshot. Everything happened in the space of a heartbeat. Grayson's leg plunged through into the water beneath the current, grabbing at him, trying to pull him downstream. His ankle struck a submerged rock with force enough that Margot heard the impact over the sound of breaking ice. He screamed, a high, desperate sound that echoed through the winter forest, and scrabbled for purchase on the crumbling edge. Margot and Finn grabbed him together, hauling him back onto solid ice and then onto the snowy bank. His right leg was soaked to the knee, already freezing in the December air, and when he tried to stand, his face went white with pain. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." She was already pulling off his boot, her fingers clumsy with cold and fear. The ankle had swollen visibly, the tissue hot and tight under her touch. When she pressed gently on the joint, Grayson whimpered and tears streamed down his face. Not broken. She could tell that much from medical training that consisted entirely of internet research and maternal instinct. But badly sprained, grade 2, at least the kind of injury that required rest and elevation and ice, none of which she had to offer in the middle of a frozen forest with 2 more miles to walk. She wrapped his wet foot in a dry sock from her pack and forced the boot back on, knowing it would be agony, but necessary to provide support. Then she knelt in the snow and looked into her 7-year-old son's eyes, seeing pain and fear and guilt all tangled together. "Can you walk? I need you to be honest with me." Grayson's voice came out small and shaky. "It hurts really bad, but I can try." Finn was already moving, taking Grayson's backpack and adding it to his own burden without being asked. Beckett positioned himself on his brother's left side, offering his shoulder for support. The puppies seemed to understand something was wrong, pressing close to Grayson's legs, their warmth and presence a comfort, if not a cure. They moved forward at half their previous pace, Grayson limping badly, his breath coming in sharp gasps whenever his injured foot touched the ground. Margot recalculated constantly. They had perhaps 1.5 miles still to go. At this speed, it would take 2 hours minimum. The sun was already past its zenith, the afternoon shadows lengthening. They would reach the cabin at dusk if they were lucky, after dark, if they were not. And somewhere behind them on that main road, the black SUV waited. Its occupants would not follow on foot while daylight remained. But once darkness fell, all advantages shifted. The woods at night belonged to those with vehicles, with resources, with the ability to return to warmth and safety whenever they chose. Margot's family had only forward momentum and stubborn refusal to give up. It would have to be enough. The terrain grew steeper as they climbed the trail, switching back and forth across the mountainside. Grayson's limp worsened with each step, his ankle swelling until Margot could see the outline of the joint through his boot. He did not complain, but she could see the pain in every line of his small body and the set of his jaw and the whiteness around his mouth. Finn and Beckett flanked their brother, their presence a silent promise that they would not let him fall. The puppies adjusted their pace, moving slower, checking back more frequently. Copper began ranging ahead 20 yards, then returning to report what he had found, an instinct hardwired into retrievers, the need to scout and retrieve information as surely as they retrieved birds for hunters. Darkness was falling in earnest when they crested a ridge and saw it. A clearing where the trees fell back and 3 separate mountain streams tumbled down from different directions, converging into a single pool before continuing their journey downslope. The sound of rushing water filled the air, a constant music that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the earth itself. And there in the center of the clearing stood a cabin. It was smaller than Margot had imagined from Michael's descriptions, maybe 12 feet by 14, built from logs that had weathered to silver gray. The roof sagged alarmingly in the middle, and one corner of the structure had settled lower than the rest, giving the whole building a drunken cant. Windows, too, visible from this angle, were clouded with decades of grime, their frames warped by moisture and time. The door hung slightly ajar, one hinge clearly broken. But it was shelter. 4 walls and a roof, however, compromised. A place to rest and warm themselves and figure out what came next. The boys staggered down the slope toward it, their exhaustion temporarily forgotten in relief at having reached their destination. The puppies bounded ahead, barking with excitement, their tails wagging in joyous celebration. Margot followed more slowly, her body aching from the hike and the weight she had carried, her mind already racing through the challenges ahead. The cabin door opened with a screech of protesting wood. Inside, the last light of day filtering through dirty windows revealed a space that was both exactly what she expected and somehow worse. A single room empty of furniture, the floorboards warped and splitting. The fireplace dominated one wall, its stones cracked and blackened, birds' nests visible in the chimney. In the far corner, a small wood stove sat, rusted and probably non-functional. But carved into the log beam above the fireplace, worn but still legible, were words that made Margot's breath catch. H.A. 1967, where 3 waters meet, wisdom waits in wood. Harrison Ashford had built this place. Michael's grandfather, the man who had supposedly been mentally incompetent and paranoid in his final years, had carved those words as a message or a promise, or perhaps just a statement of philosophy. Finn was already exploring, his natural curiosity overriding his exhaustion. "Mom, there's writing everywhere, look!" She followed his pointing finger and saw more carvings, some faint with age, scattered across the exposed log walls. Dates and initials, brief notes about weather or wildlife sightings. And one near the back corner where shadows gathered thick. "For Michael when he's ready. The foundation holds what matters. H.A. 1994. 1994, the year Harrison Ashford died. Margot's pulse quickened. The foundation. That word again appearing in Michael's map notation. And now here, carved by his grandfather 3 decades ago. She began examining the floor more carefully, looking for loose boards or hidden compartments. But darkness was falling fast and her flashlight battery was already weak. They would search in the morning. Tonight they needed warmth and food and rest. She erected the tent inside the cabin, using the structure's walls as windbreak and protection from animals. The boys helped without being asked, their movements efficient despite their exhaustion. Years of camping with Michael before his death had taught them the rituals of making shelter, and muscle memory carried them through when conscious thought failed. Margot got the camp stove working and heated canned soup that tasted better than anything she had eaten in weeks, simply because they were all so hungry. The puppies ate their kibble with enthusiasm, then curled up around Grayson, their body heat helping to ease the pain in his swollen ankle. As full dark descended, Margot stood in the cabin doorway, looking back down the trail they had climbed. No lights visible, no sound of pursuit. But she knew without question that the black SUV was still out there waiting on that main road, its occupants patient because they had resources and time on their side. She wondered if they had followed the truck's tracks down the narrow trail to the fallen tree, wondered if even now they were hiking up in the darkness, closing the distance while her exhausted family slept. But worry was another luxury she could not afford. She sealed the cabin door as best she could, wedging it shut with a chunk of firewood, then crawled into the tent where her sons and 3 puppies had already created a warm nest of sleeping bags and blankets. Finn's voice came out of the darkness, sleepy but determined. "Dad brought us here, didn't he? This is where he wanted us to be." Margot pulled him close, feeling Grayson and Beckett on her other side, the puppies a warm weight across their legs. "Yes, sweetheart. I think this is exactly where he wanted us to be." Outside, the 3 streams sang their ancient sukkits. Inside, her family slept the dreamless sleep of the utterly spent, and somewhere in the foundation beneath them, if Michael's clues were true, waited answers to questions she had not known to ask. The night passed in uneasy quiet, every creak of settling timber jerking Margot awake, every whisper of wind through the broken door setting her heart racing. But no footsteps approached. No flashlight beams swept through the windows. Whatever surveillance the black SUV represented, it did not extend to night operations in unfamiliar terrain. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the grime on the windows, until Margot could make out the interior of the cabin in detail. She extracted herself carefully from the sleeping pile of boys and puppies, her body protesting every movement, muscles stiff from yesterday's hike and a night on the hard ground. The cabin looked worse in daylight. Water damage stained the ceiling in spreading brown patterns. The floorboards near the door had rotted through, exposing bare earth beneath. Mice had built elaborate nests in the corners from leaves and bits of fabric scavenged from who knew where. The whole structure reeked of abandonment and decay, but that carving above the fireplace drew her attention like a magnet. "The foundation holds what matters." She began examining the hearthstones, looking for anything loose or out of place. Most were mortared solidly, but one near the front edge shifted slightly when she pressed on it. Copper appeared at her elbow, his golden head cocking to one side as he watched her work. Then, without any command or encouragement, he began scratching at that same stone, his paws working with surprising precision at the edges where mortar had crumbled away. Within minutes, Flint and Ash had joined him, all 3 puppies digging with focused intensity at that single spot. Their behavior went beyond curiosity or playfulness. This was purposeful, driven by scent or instinct, or perhaps training that Michael had embedded so deeply it had become automatic. The boys woke to the sound of scratching and emerged from the tent, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Finn immediately grasped what was happening and dropped to his knees beside the puppies, adding his small hands to their efforts. Together, women, children, and dogs, they worked the stone loose. It was larger than Margot had realized, perhaps 40 pounds, requiring all 4 humans to lift it aside. Beneath, cut into the earth and lined with more stones to prevent collapse, was a cavity about 18 inches deep. Inside sat a waterproof case, the kind used by hikers and kayakers to protect valuables from moisture. Its seal was still intact after however many years it had waited here. Margot lifted it out with trembling hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. The case opened with a soft pop of released pressure. Inside, organized with careful precision, lay 4 items that would change everything she thought she knew about her husband's death and his family's intentions. A brass key, small and elegant, with a tag attached that read, "First National Bank, Chattanooga, Box 447. A letter, 12 pages of Michael's handwriting on his familiar notebook paper, folded carefully and addressed to my Margot in script that made tears spring to her eyes. A silver locket on a delicate chain. When she opened it with shaking fingers, she found 3 tiny photographs, each one showing a newborn baby with Michael's features. The triplets on the day they were born, their faces red and wrinkled and impossibly precious. And a USB drive in a protective case labeled simply "Trust Documents. Read this first." Margot sat back on her heels, the letter clutched in both hands, unable to process what she held. a safety deposit box in Chattanooga nearly 2 hours away. Trust documents important enough that Michael had hidden them here in this remote cabin protected by puzzles and clues that only she could follow. Marshall Hightower had been telling the truth. Michael had left her something. Not just memories and grief, but something concrete, something valuable enough that the Ashford family would hire surveillance and follow her into the mountains rather than let her find it. She was about to open the letter when Copper's low growl froze her in place. The puppy stood at the cabin door, staring out through the gap, his body rigid with tension. Flint and Ash moved to flank him, and all three began a chorus of warning barks that echoed through the small space. Margot moved to the window, wiping away just enough grime to see outside. 3 figures were climbing the trail toward the cabin, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, but closing steadily. 2 men in dark clothing, moving with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going and what they would find when they arrived. And between them, moving more slowly but with unmistakable purpose, walked Thaddeus Ashford. Margot shoved the waterproof case into her backpack with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped it twice. The key, the letter, the locket, the USB drive. All of it disappeared into the worn canvas while her mind raced through impossible options. The cabin had only 1 door and 2 windows, both too small for an adult to climb through quickly. The back window opened onto a steep slope, thick with deadfall and brambles, treacherous in good conditions and potentially fatal when running blind with 3 7-year-olds. But staying meant confrontation with Thaddeus, and she had no illusions about how that would end. He had resources, hired men, the absolute certainty of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. And she had 3 exhausted children. 3 puppies barely past their baby teeth, and a backpack containing secrets she did not yet understand, but knew were worth more than Thaddeus's carefully curated facade of civility. Finn's voice cut through her panic, steady in a way that reminded her achingly of Michael. "Mom, the back window. We can fit." She wanted to tell him no, to explain that the terrain beyond that window was suicide, that Grayson could barely walk on his swollen ankle, much less scramble down a mountainside. But the alternative was worse, and children often saw paths adults had trained themselves to dismiss as impossible. "Get your brothers ready, coats on, boots tight. We're going out the back, and we're not stopping until we're safe." Beckett was already crying, silent tears streaming down his face as he struggled with his coat zipper. Grayson stood on 1 foot, his injured ankle held carefully off the ground, his face pale with pain and fear. The puppies sensed the urgency, pressing close to the boys' legs, whining low in their throats. Margot forced the back window open, old wood shrieking against swollen frame, and looked down at the slope below. 20 feet of near vertical drop to a narrow ledge, then another 30 feet of loose scree and fallen timber, before the ground leveled out near the stream convergence. In summer it might have been navigable. In December, with ice coating every surface and snow hiding the worst hazards, it was a death trap. The front door shuddered under a heavy blow. Thaddeus's voice carried through the wood, smooth and reasonable and absolutely implacable. "Margot, I know you're in there. We need to talk about what you found. This doesn't have to be difficult." Another impact, harder. The door's broken hinge groaned. The chunk of firewood she had used as a brace began to splinter. She pulled Finn to the window first, helping him through, watching him land on the ledge below, with the grace of childhood, and scramble for purchase on ice-slick rock. Beckett went next, his fear making him clumsy, but small size an advantage in the tight space. He dropped into Finn's waiting arms, and the 2 of them pressed against the cabin wall, making room for their brother. Grayson's face was white as paper when Margot lifted him, his injured ankle dangling uselessly. He bit his lip hard enough to draw blood when the movement jostled the joint, but he did not cry out. She lowered him as gently as she could, Finn and Beckett reaching up to guide him down, and he landed with a gasp that might have been a scream if he had not swallowed it. The front door exploded inward, the firewood brace shattering, wood splinters flying across the cabin interior. Margot caught a glimpse of Thaddeus's face, red with exertion and fury, his expensive outdoor gear pristine despite the hike that should have left him winded. She did not wait to hear what he would say. She grabbed the backpack, whistled sharp for the puppies, and went through the window head first in a controlled fall that jarred every bone in her body when she hit the ledge. Copper, Flint, and Ash followed without hesitation, their young bodies flexible enough to absorb the impact, landing in a tumble of golden fur and scrambling paws. Thaddeus's shout followed them out, incoherent with rage, the sound of boots on cabin floorboards. Then his face appeared in the window frame, too large to fit through his eyes, finding Margot with laser focus. "You're stealing what belongs to this family. That key opens documents my grandfather had no right to hide. Stop and we can discuss this like rational adults." Margot did not waste breath on a response. She grabbed Grayson under one arm, motioning Finn to take his other side, and they scrambled down the scree slope in a barely controlled slide. Rocks shifted under their feet, ice broke and sent them skidding sideways and twice. Margot was certain they would all tumble into the stream confluence and die in frigid water that would stop their hearts in minutes. But somehow luck or divine intervention or simply the physics of desperation, they reached the bottom intact. Behind them she could hear Thaddeus shouting orders to his hired men, directing them to circle around, to cut off escape routes, to move faster, before the family disappeared into the forest. The puppies had already chosen a direction, noses to the ground, bodies low and purposeful as they broke trail through snow that came up to their chests. They were heading downstream, following the largest of the three converging waters where the current had carved a path through the winter landscape. Margot followed without question, trusting instincts that were older than human civilization, the knowledge bred into retrievers that water meant safety and movement meant survival. Finn and Beckett supported Grayson between them, their small faces set with determination that broke something in Margot's chest, even as she felt fierce pride at their strength. They moved as fast as the injured boy could manage, which was agonizingly slow, each step a negotiation with pain and swelling tissue. The stream led them through dense pine forest where snow lay thinner under the canopy. Sound became muffled, distances deceptive. Margot could hear pursuit behind them, but could not gauge how close, could not tell if Thaddeus's men were gaining or falling back. She kept moving, kept pushing her sons forward, kept following the puppies who seemed to know exactly where they were going. 15 minutes into their flight, the terrain changed. The stream dropped away, suddenly cutting through rock in a ravine perhaps 40 feet deep. Water tumbled down in a half-frozen waterfall ice, coating the rocks in layers that caught the weak morning light and threw it back in fractured rainbows. The ravine was maybe 18 feet across at its narrowest point, and spanning it was a natural bridge formed by a massive hemlock that had fallen years ago. The tree was dead, its bark sloughing off in gray sheets, its trunk coated in ice and snow. It looked about as stable as balancing on a greased pole suspended over a fatal drop. Copper trotted across it without hesitation, his weight distributed on 4 paws, barely making the ice crack. Flint followed, then Ash, all three disappearing into the forest on the far side before circling back to watch the humans with expressions that seemed to ask what was taking so long. Finn went next before Margot could stop him, dropping to hands and knees and crawling across the icy surface with the fearlessness of a child who had not yet learned to properly fear death. He made it to the other side and turned back, his voice carrying across the gap. "Mom, it's okay, just go slow." Beckett followed his brother's example, crawling on his belly, distributing his weight across as much surface as possible. The ice groaned but held. He reached the far side and immediately turned to help his brothers, their teamwork unconscious and perfect. Grayson's face when Margot lifted him toward the bridge would haunt her for years. Terror and pain and trust all mixed together, his faith that somehow his mother would keep him safe even when physics and common sense suggested otherwise. She helped him onto the log, Finn and Beckett reaching across to support him, and together they pulled him across inch by agonizing inch, while Margot's heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to crack bone. He was halfway when the ice beneath him cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. His good leg slipped, his body tilted sideways, and for one eternal second Margot was certain she was about to watch her son fall to his death in front of her. But Finn had his arm, Beckett had his coat, and together they hauled him forward with strength that should not have existed in bodies so small. Grayson collapsed on the far side, sobbing with pain and relief, and Margot started across. She made it 3/4 of the distance before she heard boots pounding through snow behind her. A glance back showed Thaddeus emerging from the tree line, his face twisted with fury and something that might have been fear. He saw her on the bridge, saw the key to everything he believed he deserved. Disappearing across an icy ravine, and made a decision that would cost him everything. He ran at the bridge with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences. His weight easily 200 pounds compared to Margot's 130, combined with momentum and the fundamental instability of ice-coated dead wood, created a situation that physics resolved with brutal efficiency. The crack was louder this time, deeper, the sound of structural failure rather than surface fracture. The ice shattered. The log shifted, began to roll. Thaddeus's boots lost purchase, and he went down hard on his stomach, his hands scrabbling for purchase on bark that came away in strips. Then he was hanging by his fingertips over the drop, his legs dangling, his face gone white with terror. Behind him, his 2 hired men skidded to a stop at the ravine's edge, neither willing to trust their weight to a bridge already failing. Margot completed her crossing in 3 running steps, not looking back, not allowing herself to feel anything about Thaddeus's situation because sympathy was a luxury that would cost her sons their freedom. She grabbed Grayson, hoisted him onto her back despite his weight and her exhausted muscles, and ran. Behind them, Thaddeus's screams for help echoed through the winter forest. The sound chased them through the pines, a reminder that the cost of her escape would be measured in relationships beyond repair and consequences she could not yet imagine. They ran for another hour, following the stream as it descended through increasingly rough terrain. The puppies maintained their lead position, tireless in the way only young animals can be, checking back frequently to ensure the family followed. Margot's back screamed where Grayson's weight dug into her shoulders. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. Her lungs burned in the cold air. When they finally stumbled out onto a maintained Forest Service road, she nearly wept with relief. The road meant civilization, meant vehicles that could cover distance faster than frozen feet, meant escape routes that did not involve climbing over dead trees and risking death by falling. She was standing in the middle of the road, trying to decide which direction offered better hope, when a green Forest Service truck appeared around a bend, moving slowly as its driver checked trail conditions. The truck stopped when the driver saw them. A man in his mid-30s with dark hair and a ranger's uniform jumped out, his expression transforming from curiosity to alarm as he took in the scene. A woman barely standing, 3 small boys in various stages of hypothermia, and 3 young dogs who looked like they had been through a war. His voice was professional, but kind, the tone of someone trained for emergency situations. "Jesus, how long have you been out here?" Margot tried to explain the cabin, the pursuit, the bridge, but the words came out jumbled and confused. She could feel herself shaking, adrenaline draining away and leaving only bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. The ranger moved past her questions to immediate triage, already pulling emergency blankets from his truck. "I'm Silas Drummond. You're in serious trouble here. These kids need warming now." He began loading the boys into his heated cab, wrapping them in silver mylar blankets, cranking the heat to maximum. His movements were efficient and practiced, someone who had dealt with hypothermia cases before and knew every second counted. Margot tried to refuse help, some instinct warning that involving authorities might bring complications she could not afford. But Silas's expression brooked no argument. "Lady, your youngest's lips are blue. The one with the bad ankle is shivering so hard his teeth are chattering, and you look like you're about 3 minutes from collapse. We can argue about what happened after. I'm sure nobody's dying. Understood?" His absolute certainty made resistance impossible. She nodded and let him guide her to the passenger seat. Let him wrap her in blankets, let him press a thermos of hot coffee into her hands that she could barely hold because her fingers had gone numb without her noticing. The puppies jumped into the truck bed, settling into a nest of emergency supplies with the calm acceptance of animals who trusted their humans to know what they were doing. Silas closed the tailgate and climbed into the driver's seat, already reaching for his radio. Before he could transmit, Margot's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. "Please, don't call it in yet. There are people following us. They'll use any official report to find us." Silas's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from helpful ranger to something harder, more calculating. People following you through winter mountains with 3 kids. That sounds like either a custody situation or something criminal. Which is it? The honest answer was she did not know. Was it legal for Thaddeus to pursue her? Did his family's wealth and influence extend to claiming she had stolen something that belonged to them? Would a sympathetic judge see a desperate mother protecting her children, or a thief running with stolen property? Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. My husband died. His family evicted us. I found something he left me and they want it. I don't know what's legal anymore. I just know I can't let them take my sons. Silas studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the boys huddled in the back seat, to the puppies watching through the rear window. Whatever calculus he performed came down in her favor. I did 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment, learned to recognize predators when I see them. He put the radio handset back in its cradle without transmitting. We're going to get these kids checked out and then you're going to tell me the whole story. After that, we decide what's legal and what's right. They're not always the same thing. The drive to Mountain View Regional Hospital took 40 minutes. Silas navigating forest roads with the confidence of someone who knew every turn by heart. Margot sat in silence, feeling warmth slowly return to her extremities. Listening to her son's breathing even out in the back seat as body temperature normalized. Beckett fell asleep first, his small body finally giving in to exhaustion. Finn stayed awake watching the landscape pass with eyes too old for his face. And Grayson whimpered occasionally when the truck hit a bump and jostled his injured ankle, but the sounds were getting quieter as shock and cold numbed the worst of the pain. At the hospital, a no-nonsense nurse named Patricia took one look at the family and started barking orders. IV warm saline for Beckett, whose core temperature registered at 94.2 degrees. Heating blankets for all 3 boys. X-rays for Grayson's ankle. And a thorough examination of Margot herself, who kept insisting she was fine until Patricia pointed out that her fingers showed early-stage frostbite and her judgment was clearly compromised by cold exposure. The medical staff worked with efficient kindness, asking no questions beyond what was necessary for treatment. Margot suspected Silas had said something to them, had used whatever authority his uniform conveyed to smooth over the awkward questions about how a mother ended up hypothermic in the mountains with 3 small children in December. She watched them work on her sons from a chair in the corner, wrapped in heated blankets, an IV drip in her own arm that she had finally stopped fighting. The backpack with its precious contents sat between her feet, never more than a few inches from her grasp. Inside it, Michael's letter waited unread, the key to answers she desperately needed but was too exhausted to seek. Hours passed. Beckett's temperature climbed to 96 degrees, then 97, finally stabilizing at 98.4. Grayson's x-rays came back showing no fracture, just severe soft tissue damage that would require a walking boot and weeks of rest. Finn checked out, mostly healthy, his youth and resilience protecting him from the worst effects of their ordeal. By early afternoon, they were medically cleared but still under observation. Patricia had installed them in a shared room with heated blankets and a television playing cartoons that the boys watched with glassy-eyed detachment. The hospital had even allowed the puppies to stay, some exception made for therapy animals or extraordinary circumstances. And Copper, Flint, and Ash lay in a pile at the foot of the boys' shared bed. Silas returned around 3 with food from the hospital cafeteria and news that made Margot's stomach clench. Sheriff's Department pulled a man out of a ravine about 2 hours ago. Thaddeus Ashford, according to his ID. He's claiming you assaulted him and stole property belonging to his family. Deputies asking questions about a woman and 3 kids seen fleeing the area. Margot felt the floor drop out from under her. Are they coming here? Not yet. I may have suggested the family I found was heading toward Knoxville, not here. Bought you some time, but not much. He settled into the chair beside her bed, his expression serious. You need to tell me what's really happening. All of it. So she did, starting with Michael's death and ending with the waterproof case hidden under the cabin's hearthstone. She told him about 14 months of psychological warfare at the Ashford estate, about being systematically prevented from finding work, about the eviction into winter cold with 3 children and $500. She told him about Marshall Hightower's warning and the safety deposit box and Michael's cryptic messages about foundations and futures. When she finished, Silas sat back with an expression somewhere between impressed and appalled. So you have a key to a box that might contain documents worth a fortune and you don't actually know what's in it yet? No. But Marshall said it was a trust, something worth enough that Thaddeus would hire people to follow me and risk his life crossing an ice bridge to stop me from finding it. Silas pulled out his phone and made a call, walking to the window for privacy. Margot could hear only fragments. Trust documents. Safety deposit box. Need legal consult. But the tone suggested he was taking her story seriously, treating it as something beyond domestic drama. He returned 15 minutes later with news that should have been good but somehow felt like a trap closing. I've got a contact in Chattanooga, lawyer named Marshall Hightower. Margot's breath caught. That's the man who came to see me, the one who warned me about the box. He's real, and he's exactly who he claimed to be. Estate attorney, specializes in trust law. He's willing to meet you at the bank tomorrow morning if you can get there. Says he can provide security and legal representation when you open the box. Silas's expression hardened. He also says Thaddeus has filed an emergency injunction trying to prevent you from accessing it. Hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow in Knox County Family Court. The room tilted sideways. Family court. They were not going after her criminally, but through the system designed to protect children, claiming she was unfit or unstable or whatever story would allow them to take custody and control of the trust. I can't fight them in court. I don't have money for lawyers or time to prepare a defense. You don't need to fight them in court. Silas's voice carried the calm certainty of someone used to making tactical decisions under pressure. You need to get to that bank first. Open the box, secure whatever documents are inside, and establish legal ownership before the hearing. Once you control the trust, their family court motion becomes irrelevant. Margot looked at her sons sleeping in the hospital bed, at the puppies keeping watch over them, at the backpack containing a dead man's promises. Tomorrow was Saturday. Banks did not open until 9. The hearing was at 9. Even if she left now, drove straight to Chattanooga, she would arrive too late. Unless she left tonight. Unless she drove through darkness with 3 exhausted children and arrived at dawn waiting on the bank steps when the doors opened. It was insane. It was desperate. It was exactly what Michael would have expected her to do when everything else failed to fight with whatever tools remained and refused to give up even when logic suggested defeat. Can you help me get out of here without being seen if Thaddeus knows which hospital we're in? He doesn't. And I've got a truck with tinted windows parked in the service entrance. If you're serious about this, we leave in 30 minutes. Margot looked at him properly for the first time, seeing past the ranger uniform, to the man who had chosen to help a stranger fleeing through winter mountains. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You could lose your job. Silas's expression did not change, but something in his eyes suggested old pain, old debts. 5 years ago, my sister ran from an abusive husband. Took her kids and disappeared in the middle of the night with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes. Every cop in 3 counties was looking for her because he claimed she'd kidnapped them and she had no money for lawyers to prove otherwise. He stood checking his watch, his movements crisp and professional. A park ranger found her camping illegally in Cherokee National Forest. Could have arrested her, called it in, sent those kids back to a man who broke their mother's ribs twice. Instead, he gave her directions to a women's shelter and forgot he ever saw her. Told me later that some rules matter less than doing what's right. The story hung in the air between them, a gift and a challenge. Margot had 30 minutes to decide if she trusted this stranger. If she was willing to bet her son's future on instinct and the hope that not everyone in uniform served the powerful over the desperate. She looked at Finn, Grayson, and Beckett sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. At Copper, Flint, and Ash guarding them with the loyalty Michael had bred into them. At the backpack with its promise of answers. 30 minutes, we'll be ready. Night had fallen by the time Silas smuggled them out through the hospital's loading dock. The boys drowsy but mobile, the puppies alert and watchful. His personal truck was exactly as promised, an older model Silverado with windows tinted dark enough that no one could see inside. He had installed the boys in the back seat with blankets and pillows scrounged from somewhere, created a nest where they could sleep through the drive. The puppies rode in a covered truck bed, protected from wind, but with enough ventilation to stay comfortable. They settled immediately, tired from their mountain ordeal, trusting that the humans had everything under control, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Margot climbed into the passenger seat and immediately opened Michael's letter, her hands shaking as she unfolded pages that had waited years for her to find them. His handwriting covered both sides of each sheet, cramped and urgent, the script of someone who knew time was running out. The first paragraph made her vision blur with tears. "My dearest Margot, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm so sorry I kept secrets from you. Sorry I didn't tell you about grandfather's trust, about the safety deposit box, about everything I hid because I was terrified of what my family would do if they knew you knew. But you found this, which means you followed the clues I left, which means you're exactly as brilliant and stubborn as I always believed." The letter went on for pages, explaining things Michael had never spoken aloud. How his grandfather Harrison had created an irrevocable trust in 1965, funding it with $38 million from the sale of his manufacturing company. How Harrison had watched his own son, Michael's father Daniel, squander money and abuse power until the old man had quietly removed him from the inheritance entirely. How the trust had grown over decades of careful management to a current value of $117 million. And how, when Michael married Margot and they had the triplets, the trust's terms had activated. Harrison's will specified that the fortune would pass to Michael upon his 30th birthday, or upon the birth of his first child, whichever came first. The moment Finn Grayson and Beckett had entered the world, Michael had become the beneficiary of a staggering fortune. The letter's next section made Margot's hands shake so badly she nearly dropped the pages. "I never accessed the money because the trust had conditions. I couldn't touch the principal until after my 35th birthday, only the interest. But even the interest would have been millions per year. I kept it secret because I saw what money did to my family, turned them into predators who measured human worth in dollars and saw kindness as weakness. I wanted to build our life with my own hands to prove we didn't need their poison. I planned to tell you everything on our 10th anniversary. Planned to surprise you with the knowledge that our sons would never want for anything. Never have to choose between heat and food like you did growing up." He had died 3 years before that anniversary, taking his secrets to the grave and leaving Margot to piece together truth from fragments and cryptic carvings. The final paragraphs explained the key, the box, the documents. "Everything you need is in box 447. Trust papers, investment statements, account access codes. Marshall Hightower is the trustee, the only person besides me who knew the truth. He'll help you navigate the legal maze. But Margot, please understand, the money isn't the real inheritance. The real gift is freedom. Freedom from people like my mother and brother. Freedom to raise our sons without compromise or submission. Use it not for luxury, but for safety, for education, for the space to become whoever they're meant to be without money poisoning them like it poisoned my family. Teach them that wealth without character is just decorated poverty. That's what grandfather wanted. That's what I want. That's what you'll give them because you're the only person I ever met who understood that love matters more than gold. I miss you already. I'll love you forever. Take care of our boys, Michael." Margot folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the waterproof case, her grief so profound it felt physical. A weight pressing on her chest that made breathing difficult. Michael had known. He had prepared for this possibility, had left her a map through the darkness, and she was following it now in a stranger's truck through Tennessee night, racing toward answers and a confrontation with a family who would stop at nothing to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. The drive to Chattanooga took 3.5 hours, Silas navigating through darkness with the confidence of someone who knew these roads intimately. They stopped once at a 24-hour gas station where Margot used the bathroom and bought coffee that tasted like burned rubber but provided necessary caffeine. The boys slept through the stop exhausted beyond waking their small bodies, recovering from hypothermia and terror in the only way children knew how: complete surrender to rest. They reached Chattanooga at 1:30 in the morning and parked in a 24-hour lot near the bank, Silas positioning the truck where they could watch the entrance but remain mostly hidden. The city was quiet at this hour, only occasional cars passing the downtown district deserted except for a few homeless men settling into doorways for the night. Margot could not sleep. She sat in the passenger seat watching the bank's facade, a neoclassical building with columns and marble that spoke of old money and institutional permanence. Somewhere inside that structure, in a vault behind multiple security measures, waited documents that would change her sons' lives forever. If she could reach them before Thaddeus's lawyers shut her out. If the court order had not already frozen access. If Marshall Hightower could actually deliver the help he promised. Too many ifs, too many variables beyond her control. But sitting still while fate decided her future had never been an option, not for someone who had fought her way through college while working 3 jobs, who had married a man his family dispersed because she loved him, who had survived 14 months of psychological warfare rather than abandon her sons to their grandmother's tender mercies. She would be on those steps when the bank opened. She would get inside that vault, and whatever happened after, she would face it knowing she had done everything possible to honor Michael's final gift. Dawn came slowly to Chattanooga, the sky lightening from black to gray to pale blue while the temperature hovered just above freezing. At 7:30, Margot woke the boys and walked them to a diner 3 blocks from the bank where they ate pancakes and eggs that tasted like sawdust but provided necessary fuel. The puppies stayed in the truck with Silas, who had volunteered to keep watch for any sign of Thaddeus or his hired men. At 8:45, Marshall Hightower appeared, walking briskly down the sidewalk with a briefcase in one hand and a phone pressed to his ear. He saw Margot standing on the bank steps with her sons and ended his call, his expression grave. "Mrs. Lindgren, I'm glad you made it. We have a situation." He glanced at the boys, clearly uncertain how much to say in front of them. "The injunction was filed at 7 this morning. Judge Morrison issued a temporary freeze on Box 447 pending this afternoon's hearing." Margot felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "So we can't access it?" "Not exactly. The freeze only applies if you're accessing the box as an individual, but according to the trust documents I hold as administrator, you're not accessing it individually. You're accessing it as the legal guardian of the trust beneficiaries, your 3 sons. Different legal status, different authority. It's a technicality, but it should hold." He pulled documents from his briefcase, multiple copies of the trust master agreement, birth certificates for the triplets, Michael's death certificate. "I've already spoken to the bank manager. She's willing to allow access based on these documents, but we need to move fast. The Ashford family attorneys will file a motion to clarify the judge's order within hours. Once they realize what we're doing." They entered the bank at precisely 9 a.m. when the doors unlocked, Marshall leading the way with the absolute confidence of someone who knew banking law backwards and forwards. The manager, a woman named Susan Harrington with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, met them in the lobby and escorted them directly to the vault access without the usual protocols. Mr. Hightower explained the situation. "I've reviewed the trust documents and confirmed your legal standing, but I need to warn you, Mrs. Lindgren. We've already received 2 phone calls this morning from attorneys representing Thaddeus Ashford demanding we prevent your access. This is going to get very ugly very fast." Margot had lived through worse than ugly. She had endured eviction, poverty, hypothermia, and pursuit through winter mountains. Whatever legal warfare Thaddeus wanted to wage, it could not possibly be worse than watching her sons shiver in a freezing trailer or cry when their grandmother called them mistakes. "Let's open the box."